Great. So I'd like to welcome you. My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas. And it's my delight to welcome you here today to our current meeting of the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas. We will have its current director, Dr. Naomi Lindstrom, introduce our speaker in just a moment. I want to highlight a couple of upcoming events that are before us. Actually, this afternoon at 5 o'clock, Joel Burnett from Baylor University will be speaking in person in Patton Hall 1.302E, giving a lecture entitled Gods and Kings of the Iron Age Levant. And then a really kind of unique and special event next Wednesday. We're jointly hosting Dr. David Kaufman of York University, who will be speaking on his recent award-winning monograph, The Jews Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America. And you can find out more information about the event on our website at liberalarts.utexas.edu/SCJS, and hopefully also be able to register there for that fun webinar we're going to be doing next Thursday night at 7 p.m. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Naomi Lindstrom, who is the Gale Professor of Jewish Arts and Culture, as she to welcome her to introduce our speaker for today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lindstrom.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm thrilled to have Laura Arnold Liebman here today to speak to us. I wish she were here in person, but this is what we could do at the moment. She's professor of English and Humanities at Reed College and at the Association for Jewish Studies. She serves on the executive board. She's a vice president for program. Some of you may have received her call for papers this morning for the next AJS conference. She originally came from a literary studies background, studying text, but in recent times, she's become more known for studies having to do with material, culture, objects, and space. And she's the author of The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, published by the Bard Graduate Center in 2020. It won 3 National Jewish Book Awards. And another of her notable books is from 2013, Messianism, Secrecy, and Mysticism, A New Interpretation of Early American Jewish Life. And she's the co-editor of the multi-authored volume, Jews in the Americas. Very suitable since we're at an event for the Gale Collaborative on Jewish Life in the Americas. That's an immense and full of information volume, 1,600 pages. So something to say about Laura's books, not only is the content very original and intellectually stimulating, but especially the recent ones have wonderfully reproduced and well-chosen illustrations. So you can just delight in the illustrations as well as being intellectually aroused by the content. So I look forward not only to hearing her talk, but also to seeing the visuals that will accompany it. Laura is also a member of the editorial board of the Shalvi Hyman Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, which was published less than a year ago as an open access resource. This is a project of the Jewish Women's Archive, and that's actually how I come to know Laura. Laura has held visiting positions at Bard Graduate Center, Oxford University, University of Utrecht, and the University of Panama. And her latest book, Once We Were Slaves, published by Oxford University Press just last year, was a finalist, again, National Jewish Book Awards. It's about an early multiracial Jewish family who began their lives enslaved in the Caribbean and became some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. I'd also like to mention that Laura is one of the few redeeming features of Facebook. You can follow the story of her beloved pugs, which could not be with us today, but Laura assures me they're here in spirit. And many other continuing stories that play out episodically on her Facebook page. So I recommend that as well as her books. Okay, Laura, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen. So for some reason you're not seeing those images, definitely let me know, as they'll be helpful as I move forward. So I'm really excited today to be here, in part because I'm presenting today part of my new book project, which I've sort of tentatively entitled The Fabric of Belonging. And this collection is looking at how Jews use textiles to weave stories about belonging and exclusion during the age of empire in the 19th century. So in each of the different chapters, I'm looking at how Jews are transforming consumable objects, things that belong to them, into these kind of tapestries of connection. And I'm interested in those stories about connection in part because we really think about belonging as being one of the most basic kinds of human desires. Both emotionally and physically, humans really have this strong need to be part of something larger than themselves. And as Jamaican sociologist Orlando Patterson puts it, happiness is being part of a membership, and being is about belonging. So in this new book, The Fabric of Belonging, I really want to augment our understanding of the role that material culture and material objects play in those stories of inclusion. Part of my interest in including objects has to do with the fact that scholars often will assert that one of the problems of consumer culture is that belongings cannot satisfactorily fill those voids created by industrial society. And in this book, I really want to argue otherwise, particularly objects which were close to the body. So during the long 19th century, Jews used textiles to stitch community together and to display their ties to one another. This is a time period in which there are newly formed Jewish sewing circles where multiple hands would be working together to refashion these kind of machine-made calicles into something personal and entwined with emotions. And in the hands of these synagogue sisterhoods, sewing becomes almost a religious rite, something that's meant to create and to repair covenants. But even when Jews were stitching clothing and objects alone, a dress or a vest could help the wearer feel tied to the creator of that object and fashioned to the community. By focusing on fabrics rather than politics in a kind of abstract sense, I'm hoping to shift our understanding of where fights about belonging were waged and by whom they were waged. Most of the discussions of Jewish belonging in that long 19th century period have tended to focus on wealthy men's quests for citizenship and civil rights, including in my own work. But by shifting that focus of belonging onto sewn things, I'm hoping to balance those discussions of belonging between those community leaders and other Jews who were marginalized not only by Gentile society, but also by Jewish communities themselves. Moreover, by folding race into these discussions of inclusion, I want to emphasize Jews' dual role as both agents and victims in these stories of estrangement. And rather than seeing multiracial Jews as a sort of side strand to this history, I want to show how they're interwoven into this most essential issues facing 19th century Jewish communities. So with that background in mind, I'd like to turn to one of the stories of belonging that Jews use fabric to tell in Suriname in the second half of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. And in this talk, I'm really interested in the Jewish use of an Afro-Surinamese garment called the kotomisi, which we see a Jewish woman wearing here. And its accompanying headscarf and angisa. So like today, the kotomisi played an essential role in the production of Surinamese identity. Today, it's often identified as a national costume of Suriname, and wearing the costume means that somebody is laying claims to being Surinamese. But from the late 19th century onwards, the costume also played a key role in festivals, such as this 1923 festival of Queen Wilhelmina's birthday in downtown Paramaribo, the main city in Suriname. And you'll notice that the banner that we see here has a picture of Queen Wilhelmina on one side, and then another banner saying, "Long live the Queen." Here, the costumes, along with the procession and the banners, are emphasizing the women's belonging to the colony of Suriname, because Suriname would become independent until 1975. That's also belonging to the Netherlands in some sense. Yet at the same time, the costumes also are making an argument about who truly belongs in Suriname and who Suriname belongs to, namely free Afro-Surinamese people with whom the women's costume is associated. For while the kotomisi had its origins in the era when slavery was legal, it officially begins in 1873, about 10 years after slavery is abolished. And this date is tied to changes in the clothing laws related to Afro-Surinamese women. So while during slavery, Afro-Surinamese women were often prohibited from fully covering their chests, starting in 1874, there was a new law that forbid women to leave their upper bodies uncovered, whether they were inside or outside of the house. And consequently, from this time onward, they started to use those longer skirts to cover their chests as well as their lower body. And this was the origins of this form, the kotomisi. So in this sense, the kotomisi is not merely a sign of Afro-Surinamese identity, but also this moment of liberation and an ability to limit who gets to see women's bodies. The kotomisi is also an identity tool that was used specifically by Surinamese Jews, both as viewers and as wearers of the garment. And this history of viewing and wearing was complex, since by the time the dress was invented, over half of the Surinamese Jewish community had at least one African ancestor. We can see this in the celebration I showed you a moment ago. While the photographer's not visible in the photograph, we actually do know her name. It was Augusta Curiel, and she was a multiracial woman of Jewish descent. Moreover, this particular photo was crucial to Curiel's own staging of her belonging, as it was included as part of a photo album of Suriname that she presented to Queen Wilhelmina on the Queen's 25th anniversary. And as a plea for a kind of insider status, this gift absolutely worked, because in 1929, Curiel became the designated purveyor to the royal household. And this was the first time that the Queen had ever awarded such a position to a Surinamese company. So Curiel's role as a Jewish viewer of these kotomisis, it turns out, wasn't unusual. The very same years that this dress was coming into being, the photography industry took off, and Surinamese Jews played a crucial role in documenting the garment's history and its place in Surinamese life. So today I want to talk about Surinamese Jews and how they were using the kotomisi and images of the kotomisi to create and navigate and challenge racial-ethnic categories that were related to notions of who belonged in Suriname. And I'm interested in how Jews were using clothing to reinforce racial and gendered power dynamics, but at other times to destabilize those very dynamics themselves. So my talk's going to consist of 4 parts. First, I'm going to start with what I consider the curious case of Philip Sampson, and then I'm going to move on to photographs and how they were contributing to these racial and ethnic categories, and then particularly the relationship between Jews and photographs in kotomisi, and then I'll return to Philip and show how that context can help us understand what's going on in his image. So throughout these 4 parts, I'm going to be arguing that Jews were using this garment to stitch together, piece by piece, stories of belonging during this age of empire. Yet, just as the kotomisi itself was using a hidden language to defy local hierarchies, so too this photographic evidence of the kotomisi underscores the way in which our reading of the past is always contingent on what the wearer themselves wanted to reveal to the photographer. So let's start with that curious case of Philip Sampson. Perhaps no piece of evidence about Jews and kotomisi better illustrates the slipperiness of understanding the messages embedded in Jewish interactions with the kotomisi than this photograph of Philip Sampson. Somewhere between 1930 and 35, Philip, or Philly Sampson, had his photo taken at a portrait studio in Paramaribo wearing a kotomisi and angisa, that traditional dress and headgear of Afro-Surinamese women. During this time, Samson was an insider in Jewish Surinamese society because he served as the assistant Hazzan at the Ashkenazi Neve Shalom Synagogue, which is located right here. Yet his life also defied certain Jewish norms. Born in 1902, Philip married Hannah Samuels in 1928, and while the couple never had any biological children, they did go on to adopt their nephew, who is the biological son of Hannah's sister. Photos of Samson defy our easy understandings of how male Jews use clothing to proclaim that insider status and belonging to the synagogue and colony. The photograph of Philip in the kotomisi is hardly the only surviving photo of him. In fact, most show him either wearing the kind of clothing that was emphasized traditional ties to a Jewish community and to the metropole. So kind of characteristic example is this one of him in the synagogue, strategically positioned on the teva, which at this point was the male space of the synagogue. And he's wearing a garment, a talit, that would have been worn only by men in the community at this time. As you can see in this more recent photograph of that same synagogue, the teva or reader's platform face the ark, but all the sitters are facing the teva. So he's really sort of central in this gaze and identity of the synagogue. But within the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century, the space of the teva was also racialized, as Jewish members of the congregation who were considered non-white would not have been allowed to be called up to that platform to be read. Other photographs of the time show Samson in his law office or sometimes with his family, but in all of them, Samson is wearing the kind of dark business suit or evening suit and white shirt that would have been equally acceptable in Holland and that were the staple of elite male Dutch clothing. So the 1935 photograph of Philip in his kotomisi is the only one of him in women's dress. And I want to ask, how should we be understanding this kind of evidence in this photograph? Is it an instance of a sort of racial and gendered blackface in which Philip, a white male heterosexual Jew, is appropriating the garb of a less enfranchised community in the colony? Or, given that Philip's family also had branches that reach back to Africa, is this an instance of a multiracial Jew dressing in the garbs of parts of his family that were often pushed aside and ignored? Or perhaps even more radically, given that it's the only instance where he's smiling, maybe this is his true self as he wished to be seen. And when I say that, then we should probably question my choice of pronouns here. Though other evidence outside of the photograph suggests that he used male pronouns. So Philip's photograph, I think, is an important reminder of the ambiguity of evidence and the ways in which the kotomisi has been used to undermine boundaries and binaries within Surinamese society. And perhaps more than any other form of art, the photos are often taken as being somehow unquestioned documentary evidence of Jews in previous eras. And even in collections of photography in Suriname, often early photographs have been used as if there were no art involved in creating the photographs, either by the person taking the photo or the person being represented. And I want to suggest today we should be really suspicious of that impulse. Early photographs from Suriname played a really important role in navigating and creating these racial and ethnic categories. And Jews themselves were a crucial part of the Surinamese photography industry, a role that's largely been unacknowledged. Through the photographs of the kotomisi, Surinamese Jews were working to create and navigate and challenge these racial and ethnic categories. And in doing so, they were shaping stories about Jews' complicated history of belonging to the colony. And this is where I think thinking about that word belonging becomes really important. While the verb form of belonging implies a sense of being and kinship, belonging as a noun suggests one's an object and the property of someone else at their disposal somehow. And as post-slavery objects, both the kotomisi and the photographs confront this crisis. How do we become belong to a group and be part of it without being possessed by it. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to the second section of my talk, the relationship between the photographs and racial and ethnic categories in Suriname. So portraiture has long been entangled in Suriname with the production of race, but the genre of the portrait and the audience are really important ways that scholars have tended to ignore. That is, Jewish photographs of the kotomisi are complicated not only by who's wearing the garment, but by who's looking at who's wearing the garment. So not all Jewish photographers racialize their subjects in the same way. Rather, the race and gender assignment of the photographers played a really important role in how people were being depicted and how Jews' relationship was staged to other members of Surinamese society. Jewish depictions of kotomisi owe much to the history of photographs in the colony. And here it's worth sort of backing up and thinking about how photography worked across history. Daguerreotypes, the earliest professional photographic process, arrived in Paramaribo, the main port, in the 1840s, shortly after they were invented in Paris. But the first known studio was opened by a Surinamese Jew named Salomon de Castillo in the late 1850s. Because of how daguerreotypes were made, these were always single images, typically commissioned by the sitters for their families. And by the 1850s, we see in other places a wet collodion technique that would allow photographers to print multiple copies from a single glass plate negative, but this process really didn't take off in Suriname until the 1860s. This all changed in 1866 when Castillo purchased an enlarging apparatus that would allow him to make landscapes and portraits even from very small originals. And these innovations shifted Surinamese photography away from primarily personal portraits, which were one-offs and which were typically commissioned by the sitter, to ready-made photographs of famous people, local types, and vistas, such as this one of a vista of the city. Castillo, for instance, sold a variety of ready-made photographs both to individually and in these pre-bound albums, like the one that Curiel had given to the Queen. This shift in technique towards these ready-made photographs impacted how race was intersecting with Surinamese photography by decreasing the agency of the sitter. Ready-made photographs differed from commissioned photographs in that with the portraits, it was always a question of the individual being depicted as they wished to be, whereas with ready-made photographs, suddenly the focus became on stereotyped representations of types of people. And these photographs were sometimes created in studios in front of a painted scene, but often were taken in sunny gardens in order to get the maximum light. So we here see an example of, like, it looks like they're in a studio, but you can actually see the garden in the background. The genre of local types owes a lot to the kind of sketches of character genre of printmaking from the 1830s in the Caribbean, notably that by Benoit and Jewish artist Isaac Mendes Belisario, and to a lesser extent, Stedman's prints from the 1790s. But while Jews were not part of Stedman's visual repertoire, they played an important role in both Benoit's prints as a kind of non-white other and in Belisario's depictions of Jamaican festivals. In the decades leading up to the photographs that I'm interested in then, Jews were playing this contested role in depictions of Caribbean types, with this ethno-racial gaze of the artists playing a really important role in determining how Jews were going to be depicted. Early on, the photographic types from the Surinamese community typically included Native Americans, Maroons, who are people who are descended from escaped enslaved people, Creoles, and people either from East India or Java who had been brought to the colony as workers. Notably, both whites and Jews were absent. In each instance of these types, clothing and jewelry and head coverings were essential to the ethnic type being depicted, with the types being kept separate through the photographer's frame or the very borders of the photograph. Well, Richard Dyer notes this was the norm for photographs of this time period. Whiteness reproduced its power by being diffuse, by being invisible, by somehow being everywhere and nowhere, and by making Blackness, or in this case, other ethnic groups, bear the burden of visibility and embodiedness. In all of these photos, clothing as the layer of culture immediately adjacent to a person's body played a crucial role in this embodiedness. Thus, from the 1860s forward, photographs used clothing to reinforce racial assignment in the colony following the end of slavery. Of the racial types depicted, Creole women, here meaning people with African ancestry who were born in the colony, were almost always depicted wearing the kotomisi and angisa. And of the types of clothing used to type people in the photographs, the kotomisi was really distinctive because it was the only one that had a specific relationship to slavery. Moreover, unlike other styles which also were used for Afro-Surinamese people, such as the maroon clothing style, the kotomisi explicitly was associated in the national consciousness with this aspect of having been enslaved. The kotomisi was also distinct because of the fuzziness of the ethno-racial category of Creole itself. Unlike the portraits of Javanese people, Hindustani, Caribs, or Arawaks, who were assumed to have had all or most of their ancestors as having belonged to one ethnic or racial category, who had one geographic homeland, Creole was a term that was for Afro-Surinamese people who were born in the colony, but might have had ancestors from multiple ethnic or racial groups, such as European, African, and possibly indigenous peoples. And while Maroons were also Afro-Surinamese, they were descended from people who had established independent communities in the interior. So in contrast to the Maroons, the Creole in Suriname generally implied a fair skin and somebody who lived in an urban environment and a sort of middle-class status, as well as some ancestors who had either been manumitted or emancipated. Moreover, the Creole was an unstable category, both within and across generations, as Suriname's racial system, both within and outside of the Jewish community, allowed for whitening. And as a result, Aviva Ben-Ur, who works specifically on Suriname, suggests that the majority of Suriname's Jewish community by the end of the 18th century would have been descended from at least one African mother, even though only 7% would have been racially categorized as Afro-Surinamese. So the category of Creole then pointed to the way in which ethnicity and physical attributes were not the only factors which created a person's racial status. By the late 19th century, when photography of these local types took off, social hierarchies further fragmented that Afro-Surinamese Creole middle class, with skin color and European clothing playing a central role in elevating a person's social status. And during this time, the kotomisi became increasingly associated with the lower classes and with labor. Yet with time, the kotomisi also became a symbol of women's resistance and their pride in their African ancestry. Kotomisi were typically made from a cotton fabric that was imported from Europe or chintz fabric imported from India, and hence their fabrics were part of this larger triangle trade that recalled materials used on the west coast of Africa. And as you can sort of see from this example, the kotomisi is really complicated. It has a lot of different parts to it, each of which played a story in the woman's depiction of herself. Some of the fabrics borrowed from the Javanese batik dyeing method, and such as the one that we see on this koto on the slide today. But in general, the fabrics themselves were explicitly part of this Creolized Suriname culture in which different traditions were meeting and merging and blending to create a new Surinamese culture. Just as crucially, that language communicated by the kotomisi and the headscarf were a dialect restricted to insiders. So the way that the koto's ribbons were folded, the way the shoulder wrap was placed, communicated if a woman was married or engaged or free, and even the style of the headdress could convey a woman's mood and allowed women to, quote, pick a quarrel, arrange a date with her lover, mock a rival, or even send a silent message. So really, as you got dressed, you were sort of communicating to other people within the community of insiders what you were focusing on that particular day. Even the pattern of the fabric had specific names that added layers of meaning and unspoken lessons to the garment being worn. And in this sense, the kotomisi and headscarf are an art form that's designed to communicate in a way that Henry Louis Gates calls signifying. That is a Pan-African style communication that's foregrounded by devices that make a point of indirection and wit, through which the speaker, or here the wearer, negotiates several orders of meaning. And as Gates notes, signifying was used not only for in-group talk, but also used for recurrent black-white encounters as a sort of masking behavior. And in that sense, the kotomisi and headscarf both display and protect the wearer's self. So in sum, the kotomisi explicitly identified the wearer as being proudly Afro-Surinamese, a category to which some, but not all, Surinamese Jews belonged, but to which many Surinamese Jews had ancestral ties. It was a clothing style that was both multiracial and creolized. And as an art form, the kotomisi and angisa communicated to an in-group as in addition to masking the self from those who might want to disrespect the wearer. Viewed through the lens of a white photographer, the wearer of the kotomisi and loco-types photos versus those commissioned photos both conform to the type that the photographer intended, but also had the potential to send these individualized and sophisticated meanings to people in that in-group, underscoring the photographer's lack of comprehension of the totality of the woman's being. Jewish participation in photography meant that Jews were implicitly on both sides of these subliminal messages. So in Paramaribo, people of Jewish ancestry, including the Castillos and the Curiels, were amongst the first proprietors of photography studios and creators of these stock photos, and hence played a really important role in how the sitters in these stock photos were being racialized. But not all the Jewish photographers racialized in the same way. Rather, the race and gender assignment of the photographers played a crucial role in how the artists depicted people. So when I'm thinking about kotomisi and Surinamese photographs, I want to ask kind of three big questions all the time, or keep them in the back of my mind. One is this a photo that's commissioned by the sitter, or is the woman intended to be representing a type? Second, what's the race of the photographer, and does the photographer also identify as Creole? And if so, with the kotomisi wearing class of Creoles? And third, does the wearing of the kotomisi appear to be a costume intended to emphasize proximity or distance from the person in the portrait and the typical wearers? So with these questions in mind, I want to turn to some early depictions of kotomisi by and of Jews. And the earliest surviving photographs taken by Jews of people in kotomisi belong to these loco-type genre. Although Solomon de Castillo was creating loco-types photographs and landscapes by the 1860s, most of the earliest depictions of kotomisi and loco-types photographs are anonymous, with the exception of those made by Augusta Curiel and her sister Anna, who between 1904 and 1937 ran a really important photography studio using that glass plate negative technique. So gender and race really impact how the subjects and the photographers are interacting, including attempts by the sitter to assert that the taking of their image doesn't represent this photographer's ability to somehow possess them as a belonging. While many of the loco-types photographs of kotomisi often depict women in a kind of joyless mood, or women who appear to be avoiding the photographer's gaze, Creel's gaze seems to elicit a much more positive response from her subjects, or at least to hold their gaze with hers. Creel herself came from a multiracial, middle-class Creole family whose ancestors included Jews, Africans, and Europeans. And her ability to add or convey emotions was really essential to why she was such an important photographer during this time period. As Matthew Thorrock puts it, a good picture should appeal to the emotions, right? And stir some sort of feelings in the spectator. Moreover, the emotions conveyed by the subject reveal how the photographer's gaze has that power either to oppress or to uplift the subject. And for centuries, Creole women have been subjected to what Fanon has called the psychological splitting of the Black consciousness under a white gaze, in which the woman felt that she was being dissected by white eyes. As part of this process of fixing the subject was the pressure to smile for white men or to present a self that was somehow a paragon of maternal civility. The refusal to smile for the often white male photographer challenged that continued authorization of the white gaze. And while Creole herself often dressed in European clothing, as we can see here, which was reflective of her class standing, one of the gifts of her photographs is that ability to somehow circumvent that white male gaze and to allow her sitters to be more than just types. As the scholars noted about W.E.B. Du Bois's photographic albums from the same period, Creole's images, like Du Bois's, suggest that the viewer could also be directed to both look and see things differently. And in this sense, Creole's photographs depict the women as helping to create a Surinamese culture without suggesting that she possesses them. The empowerment of the sitter to define her own identity is also clearly demonstrated in commissioned portraits of Jewish families in which the women wear kotomisi. And while most upper-class Jewish families show women wearing European clothing, portraits from the Fernandez Room, Fernandez, and Nassi families show women using the kotomisi to express themselves. And the most famous of these is that 1908, roughly, Fernandez Room portrait, a commissioned family photograph taken in a garden setting. The main sitter here is a woman named Clasina Elizabeth Room, and her family had been enslaved on a plantation called Guinean Friendship on the Surinamese River just north of Yoden Savannah. And that plantation was managed by a man named Este Fernandez, who was possibly the older brother of the man she eventually married. Fernandez, the man in the portrait here, was married twice and had at least 8 children with each wife. And it seems probable that the younger generation depicted here are likely Vroom's children. So while Vrooms and Fernandez didn't marry until 1899, 4 years after Fernandez's first wife died, the couple appears to have had a Surinamese marriage, that is, a kind of concubinage relationship, during the time period of Fernandez's first marriage. And according to a descendant, Vroom and Fernandez had at least 3 children prior to the first wife's death, and then 5 afterwards, plus the other 8 children from Charlotte's marriage, the first wife. Despite their unequal origins, however, in this photograph, the couple are centered in the picture. Understanding the language of the kotomisi in this photograph can enhance our understanding of Vroom's pride in her heritage as she navigated their late marriage and the intergenerational tensions in the family. Orlando Patterson notes that clothing and hairstyles were long used by enslavers to bring about the social death of the enslaved. And here we see the opposite. Vroom's kotomisi centers her pride in belonging to the African diaspora and her kinship to the men and women once enslaved on her husband's by her husband's family on the Guinean Friendship plantation. Moreover, the style of the kotomisi announces actually that it's Vroom's birthday, as she wears a style in which the koto and the yaki and the headscarf are all made from the same fabric. And this is a style that was only worn for crown year birthdays. And the color of the outfit would have indicated how old she was. Most likely, the birthday being recorded here is her 50th birthday, for which she would have worn a yellow outfit. And this would suggest not the 1908 date, but the 1904 date, 5 years after the couple married. The kotomisi she wears is also accompanied by a particular kind of headscarf in this style that was designed by a woman who had married a man who had had a lot of lovers before he married her. And she named this style after being so happy that she had been chosen. And the title refers to, "Thank God Mr. Kaderi is marrying me." So there seems to be a sort of joke going on with her headscarf as well. Around Vroom's neck is a short necklace, and based on the shape, most likely it's made out of blood coral, and on her wrist she wears bracelets, and both of these are also hallmarks of the kotomisi style. The contrast between Vroom's proud wearing of her festive koto and her children and husband's European dress suggests not only a generational difference, but a class and a racial divide within the family. And just to be clear, this isn't just that she was born into slavery. In an earlier 1845 daguerreotype of Maria Louisa de Hart, who was also born enslaved to a European Jewish father, Hart explicitly is wearing European-style clothing, as is her mother, who was also born enslaved, in a photo of an earlier painting. But because Maria Louisa de Hart's parents had legally married, she was considered white according to Surinamese racial laws, whereas Vroom's unmarried parents ensured she was not. Even as Vroom and her husband sit side by side in similar chairs, their clothing aligns them with different Surinamese ethnic racial categories, with the children following the father. By the 1920s, other members of the Fernandez family who understood themselves as white were also wearing the kotomisi, at least on festive occasions. So on the cover of her 2010 autobiography, As I Lived It, Irma Miriam Lopez Cardoso, the future wife of Hazzan Abraham Lopez Cardoso of Sherith, Israel, wears a kotomisi and angisa in a photo taken around 1930. Born Irma Miriam Robles, Lopez Cardoso was related to the Fernandez Vroom family in the previous photograph through her mother, shown here, Julia Sepora Fernandez. Despite placing herself in an image of a kotomisi on the cover of her memoir, Lopez Cardoso distanced herself racially from the image and from Afro-Surinamese women in her book, even though she later allies herself with an African-American cleaning lady in New York. While other family photos of the Lopez Cardoso included from Suriname depict the family in European-style dress, the choice for the cover seems strategically to allow Lopez Cardoso to signify for insiders that she has this allegiance to a Creolized Surinamese past, even as she places another foot in a white U.S. present. Beyond the extended Fernandez clan, Mrs. Kettler, the outside wife or concubine of Johann Friedrich Nasi, is also shown wearing a kotomisi. Interestingly, Kettler's shoulder wrap is worn over the right shoulder, which suggests either she's not married and she's not engaged. While Kettler's ancestry is unknown, Vroom was the daughter of Ashkenazi Jew Abraham Wolf Oppenheimer, the owner of the plantation on which her family was enslaved. And like Vroom and Lopez Cardoso, Kettler looks directly at and proudly at the camera. She also wears a headscarf in a very similar style to Vroom's. So photographs of Jewish women wearing the kotomisi allowed these women to undermine some of those binaries between Jewish and Afro-Surinamese identities, asserting their belonging to both worlds at once. The use of kotomisi by other members of the Jewish Surinamese families to self-fashion positive Creole identities can be contrasted with kotomisi which appear to be worn by Jews as part of Purim spiels or other performances. So several early Surinamese photos of Jews in costume remain, with photos of groups of adults typically taken in garden settings, though I've also found one of children in Purim costumes taken in a studio. One of these photographs, which is shown here, comes from the De Silva family and is labeled Dress Up. In the center is a heteronormative couple smiling and facing each other in European dress, surrounded by 6 individuals with instruments and prominent mustaches. 3 of these people wear women's clothing, and despite the family's caption, one a Javanese man's outfit while he holds an accordion. and the people in the front were kotomisi. All of them appear to be drinking, suggesting that either they dressed up for Purim or possibly as wedding gestures for this couple's wedding. The poor fit of the headscarf on the person in the front right suggests that the scarf is not part of the individual's normal clothing style. What makes their presentation stand out from other photos of kotomisi is their apparent lack of interest in passing as female. Professional performers of the era like the Rocky twins or Julian Eltidge wore wigs and makeup and used lack of facial hair to accentuate the flexible crossing of gender boundaries. But in contrast, the performance in the previous photo appears to support gender and racial binaries and hierarchies by showing that the men are actually incapable of being reduced to the women or races they're presenting themselves as. I would note, however, in making this assessment, I'm sort of privileging bodies that can pass or seek to pass as different genders than they were originally assigned. So one other way of reading this is by thinking about maybe the people in the photograph are actually disrupting the smoothness on which power depends by wearing kotomisi, and in that essence still would be seen as destabilizing boundaries. That's something that I would love to talk about more in the question and answer, but I think it sort of highlights the fact that any assessment of these photos is really tentative because we know very little about any of these men depicted in the photograph. We only know the identities of the two and sitting facing each other. So it's with these Jewish uses of kotomisi that I want to return to that original photograph of Philip Samson. Most of the photographs, as I noted, of Samson emphasize his role in the masculine sphere of Jewish Surinamese life. But like those other photographs, this photograph was also commissioned. That is, it relied on Philip to present himself as he wished. And I think the question then becomes, is this one that was commissioned like the women in the family gatherings where they're supporting their allegiance to the Afro-Surinamese Creole community? Or is it more like the Purim spiels where it's sort of emphasizing difference? I think here, unlike the dress-up photo from the De Silva family, Samson is wearing his kotomisi clean-shaven, and his attention to the authenticity of the costume, including the jewelry and the earrings, suggests a different understanding of what he's have in mind. And perhaps most importantly, he's smiling and looking directly at the camera. He seems to be happy to be seen as he is. Yet we know that Philip was neither unaware of the multiracial nature of the Jewish community, nor unaware of the significance of the Creole costume. He was a historian whose untiring research into the history of Jews in Suriname formed part of a journal that he edited, which he hoped to turn into a book. For me then, Samson's photo embraces the ambiguity of his performance without insisting upon either the protection of his whiteness and masculinity, and as such points to the way that our perception of early Surinamese photos are always contingent on what the sitter wanted to reveal. Samson's use of the kotomisi in his cross-gendered performance is crucial because the outfit invoked not only race, but also the power of the wearer to communicate what race and gender meant to herself, despite the photographer's gaze. And in this sense, the kotomisi is, to use Claire Holbrook's term, an example of transitivity, a not yet differentiated singularity from which distinct genders, races, sexes, and sexualities are generated. Or to use the language of Sarah Phillips and Heidi Kaufman, it's an example of the crossings that were characteristic of the Jewish Caribbean. Philip, in his kotomisi, is race and gender and Jewishness in a movement of the between. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I would love to take questions from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura, for such a wonderful and excellent and engaging talk about a beautiful intersection of so many cultures and issues in gender studies and thinking about Jewish life in the Americas. We have already kind of a number of questions from the chat that we can start off with. So one question, which I think was actually not by Sarah Rohr, but by looks like Dr. David Goodblatt. Was it on Purim? Did the picture, this particular picture itself, was it taken on Purim, or do you envision it being in some other time and space as well?
So what's unusual about it, so it's possible it was taken on Purim. This is where it's like so frustrating when we don't know the exact date that the photographs were taken. But it's possible that it was taken on Purim. What seems to set it apart from most of the Purim photographs from this particular community is they tended not to be done in portrait studios. So I found this one example of children who were taken to a portrait studio in the Purim costumes, but it's very unusual to find them. So they're much more likely to be groups of people dressed up in gardens and sort of more captured at the moment, as opposed to somebody deliberately dressing up and going to the studio to be represented that way. So, and I would say similarly, those portrait ones from the studios tend to be in the size that you would give to people, as opposed to the Purim ones, which tend to be sort of large photographs that you might put on a wall or something like that. So it's a really good question.
I want to ask a sort of follow-up question. I'm the son of a photographer, so I grew up with a photographer, taking pictures and doing a lot of portraitures. And he didn't have a studio, but he did a lot of portrait photographs in parks. And so the question I have is, did all of these photographers have portrait studios, or did some of them kind of just work in sort of more organic environments?
Yeah, so this is where I think some of the climate of being in Suriname is helpful to photography, in that, particularly this early photography when they need a lot of light, that it's pretty common that even people who had portrait studios would take photographs of people in garden settings or out and about in Paramaribo. So the fact that they have pretty good light in the colony really makes it useful to take photographs outside during different stages. So it's really not an either or. It's something that even if you have one thing, you'll do the other. What's interesting to me is that they tend to be you tend to see different types of photos taken in those different places, if that makes any sense. So, and different sizes of photographs depending on whether it's the ones in the studio or whether it's outside. And again, that may have to do with, like, I want to go outside when I have too many people to stuff into a small studio and still be able to, like, have enough light, etc. So,
yeah. Susie, did you want to follow up on that line of questioning? Because I know you had one question in the chat earlier, and now you have your hand raised. So
yeah, I just wanted to follow up by asking if we assume, or if we suggest that this wasn't Purim or wasn't some other life cycle context in which gender bending or gender reversal was accepted. And I don't know if there are other contexts, but you seem to indicate maybe marriages, maybe weddings. But if we assume that this wasn't one of those, is there a tradition of cross-dressing or gender bending or or transgender identity or anything else that would lead us to assume that this is anything but a normative festival context?
yeah, so I think that's a great question. So a couple things. One is Philip himself was involved in the Jewish community in Suriname from at least the late 18th century onwards, has a really strong tradition of performance groups where they would get together and put on plays. So I think it's completely, and Philip, we know he was involved in some of those groups. And they're very popular amongst men in the Jewish community. So I think it's possible that this could have been from one of those. Does that make sense? So it could have been, and that might explain, like, why it's staged this way and why he was trying to memorialize it. I still find, like, he even has, like, the pose exactly the way you're supposed to do it, which may also get at that sort of acting thing. So that's one piece. Yes, I think that there's absolutely a possibility of Jewish performances within this time period in Suriname outside of the festivals where that could have been happening. And unfortunately, we just don't know a ton, or I don't know a ton about those. I know some of the plays that they were putting on, there's often advertisements in the Jewish community about what's going on. So that's a possibility. Another possibility, however, that's been more studied by one of the photographers of Afro-Caribbean men is that he actually argues that this is there's a very large tradition between men in early photography in the Caribbean with African heritage of doing these sort of gender bending displays in photography. And he has an interesting book that includes Suriname and has some examples of these. So outside of performances where it's just part of the local culture is part of what he's arguing. So that I think is also really interesting because it suggests a different, again, it's sort of like you get pulled in different directions with this photograph, right? Like maybe it's just a performance and it doesn't have to do with his underneath self. And then there's other people who are saying there is actually a tradition if he is identifying within his multiracial heritage, there is this other tradition in Suriname as well. So
Thank you.
Sure.
I know Susie has to jump, but maybe you guys can continue the conversation more fully in the craft room at AJS in Boston in December. To loop back to our earlier conversation, I think Isabel Hedrick had a question related to shoes. Isabel, did you want to pose
I
that?
mean, this is just continuing the same conversation, and it really doesn't have to be long, but I was just looking at the shoes in the photo.
Yeah.
And they kind of look like men's shoes, but I didn't remember what they were in other photos. And I don't know if that adds to the clue or not.
Yeah,
and it's quite important because I think some of the subsequent questions are really interesting also. So
yeah, so I'll go ahead and share it again because I also am obsessed over his shoes at various points. So you can sort of see, I agree with you that they look like they might be men's shoes. And then if you go back, let me go back and see if I could go back to this one. Their feet are all covered. So it's really hard to know what their shoes are. What I find really interesting, and I don't have for whatever reason, set up a good, I'm going the wrong way. I didn't set up a good example of this and I wish that I had, but the pose that he's in and the way his foot is out is exactly how the women tend to be posed in the kotomisis in the early photograph studios. So like he's seemingly taking on a specific body stance that's associated in the photographic tradition. So I also was like, gosh, what do I make of the fact that that foot is sticking out? One, it seems like part of the stance that I associate with it. So he's being authentic in that sense. Maybe he had a hard time finding other shoes. I don't know, like it's hard to know, but I agree with you. I find that shoe sticking out really different from his other sort of immaculate attention to all the details of the costume, which is really different from a lot of the other kind of dressing up photos of kotomisi that are seen elsewhere where he's being so precise in all the different parts of it. It did make me wonder if where he got the costume from, if that makes any sense. Like, was it something that was handed down in his family or did he purchase it? Like, where is it coming from? And again, we don't know. I've talked to some of the relatives and they didn't know the backstory about it. So it's sort of interesting why, again, he includes it in a family photograph album, which is also really interesting to me. So I didn't talk about that here, but the reason why we have it is that he and his adopted son eventually moved to the Netherlands, and his adopted son donated his papers to various places in his photographs, and his son donated the family album, and this is one of the photographs in it. So that I think is also interesting, just that it's not something that he's like keeping locked in a drawer or something like that. Yeah.
So
I love the attention to the shoe because I also was like, oh, what does the shoe mean?
Well, it's also an interesting thing of like, what was the style of shoes? That might be one way to kind of get at that question too, in sort of sense of,
yeah,
in different periods of time, different men of different professions wore different styles of shoes to indicate their profession, right? So does that also mean something?
Yeah. And unfortunately that makes me wonder if we could go back I might go back and see if we can see his feet. I think he's in the back row. So I don't think we can see his feet in most of the photographs, but I'll go back and look for them and let you know.
Well, there is the one where he's standing in the shoal. You can see his feet there.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I could go back and see if it's the same pair of shoes, but the things that we obsess over as academics, right? Like, what shoes was he wearing? But I agree with you that I think it's interesting and important. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, so it does look like a, okay, I'll share the screen. It does look actually kind of similar. Here we go. Kind of similar pair of shoes.
Yeah.
Nice to put them right next to each other. See if they're the same shoes. Again, maybe he doesn't have a choice of shoes.
Yeah. It's not the day of fast fashion. So
Yeah.
So I think we've got maybe time for one more question. Susan Shapiro asked us a number of good ones in the chat, and I didn't know if Susan, you wanted to unmute and pick one that you wanted to ask, or I can pick one.
You can pick it.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
I'm going to pull on the thread of the fabric a little more, and so as Susan asked, she said, following out the thread on the study of fabric and belonging, have you examined the ways that before emancipation, at least in the United States, fabric became something that could be recognized as belonging to a particular individual woman and or slave, and thus as her property, even before married women and certainly slaves should actually own something themselves? If so, how might this connect to your study of fabric and belonging in the two senses of the term you use here?
Yeah, I love that. There's a beautiful recent book that has to deal with the use of fabrics by enslaved women in order to communicate messages to the next generation. And that's definitely something I've been sort of interested in other chapters, in terms of how both the connotations of what kinds of fabric enslaved people are allowed to have and how that's supposed to make comments on their personhood, but then also like what it means to take fabrics that you're given and transform them into new objects. So I have another chapter that's on quilts, where I'm really interested in those sorts of questions about what happens when you take something which is supposed to be mass produced or is supposed to be generic, and then actually imbue it with emotions and meaning and connection, in spite of the fact that the larger society views it as something which is completely fungible, right? Like completely interchangeable with anything else. But through that process of sewing, and through the process of how it navigates between people, becomes something entirely different. So yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of what people are allowed to possess, and the fact that fabric is so close to your body, it becomes one of those things that really is hard. Becomes sort of associated with bodies. And we definitely see this in early slave narratives as well, in terms of the use of clothing, both to disrupt boundaries between free and enslaved, as well as to like transform the self through fabrics, and allow oneself to have a kind of mobility when otherwise wouldn't have. So I think a really interesting point, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to your book.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Let's all join in just giving another round of virtual applause to Dr. Liebman for such a wonderful talk, which has really opened up some new vistas to me personally, and I'm sure helped me think about photographs during this period in the way which they enrich our study of Jewish life in the Americas. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and we hope to see all of you on future events at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies.
Thank you so much.